You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky. This is episode 56, and today I am joined by Donal Lally, who is an architect and co-founder of the architectural office Zero Degree Machine. He is an assistant lecturer in design theory at the TU Dublin School of Creative Arts, and today we're going to talk about technology and its impact on the environment, something that you may or may not have been hearing about recently. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk to Donal because this is his area of focus and he's done some really creative work in this area. So thank you so much for joining us. And can you start by just telling us about your background and your area of research?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, for having me on the show. I'm an architect by training, and practice. I practice as an architect, and I also teach design. But I found myself in recent years working more collaboratively across different types of artistic disciplines with other kinds of practitioners. And my own personal research trajectory in the last few years has led me to look at sort of the physical infrastructures of the internet. And the more I've looked at them, architecture itself only plays a kind of a part of that story. And to begin to understand them more holistically, you have to look at these structures through a variety of different kind of media and disciplines to get a kind of, I suppose, a kind of more rounded understanding of how these structures kind of exist in the world and how they produce reality in some respects. So I suppose I'm an architect and I'm looking at data centers, but then that's a much kind of wider scope of inquiry than just the kind of disciplinary boundaries of architecture itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So you basically look at the hardware in addition to just the software that we kind of take for granted and how it makes all the technology around us work, which I think sometimes people just think, you turn on your computer or you turn on your cell phone and the internet just happens, but there's a lot more that goes into that.
Yeah, and Ireland, I suppose, Ireland is a particularly rich territory to explore this topic because I suppose where I came to it initially from a purely architectural point of view, I started noticing these, these kind of big boxes starting to appear on the outskirts of Dublin, these big industrial sheds, but they were a little unlike any other industrial sheds I'd ever seen before. They had, huge exhaust pipes, and there was a much more complicated set of apparatus that seemed to be plugged into them. And they were called data centers. And there was nobody really talking about them really in any kind of, I suppose, deep way or concerned way 5, 6, 7 years ago. But they were really starting to kind of become or they were really beginning to proliferate quite quickly across the ex-urban and suburban landscapes of kind of Dublin city in particular. So we here in Ireland have 25% of European data storage, roughly speaking. We're one of the top 4 cities. Sometimes we have Dublin is sometimes the top city in Europe, sometimes the second, sometimes the third, but it's one of 4 cities that are kind of jostling constantly for data storage facilities, basically, and it plays this kind of disproportionately large role as a small city in a big continent, as a kind of one of these kind of core hosts of data storage. So, like Dublin's competitors in the data storage industry would be London, Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt, like big metropolitan kind of centers. So in a city like London, that many data centers can dissolve into the background, but in a city like Dublin, they become quite present because it's a small city, and then these things become kind of a very obvious part of the landscape, not just in their physical form, but also in the electricity they draw from the grid. So by 2027, there was a very concerning statistic kind of released by the National Energy Grids, the management company for the energy grid, EirGrid. They predicted that by 2027, about 30%, if not more, electricity, of the total electricity consumed in Ireland would be going into data centers. So that's 1/3 of all electricity in Ireland is going into the internet. And I suppose maybe I'll be even more precise about what I mean by the internet: cloud computing. You mentioned that a few minutes ago, that when we turn on our cell phones, that we don't really think about what happens to the photos we take when they kind of disappear to iCloud storage. Those storage facilities more and more are becoming more and more present, and more part of the Irish landscape. The facility to store one's cat videos, one's family videos, one's text messages, all of that stuff that's not actually being stored on your phone or your computer, that's just being distributed into something we call the cloud. So my interest really is in dispelling that kind of utopian fantasy that there is such a thing as the cloud, like a lightweight, ephemeral structure that we can just endlessly produce. We can disseminate data into. Whereas actually the reality is we can see these big, huge buildings in our landscapes that are sucking disproportionately huge amount of electricity to act as hosts for that information. So that's where my I suppose that's why I'm interested in it, because they are such a pressing concern in Ireland at the moment.
Yeah, and I do want to talk more in a minute about the environmental impact of all that in Ireland and elsewhere. But I am just curious, since you said you're competing with other European countries, is Ireland providing this data storage just for Ireland or for more of Europe? And also, why Ireland? What is it about the country that makes it so attractive for these companies? I have heard that there are very business friendly laws, and that maybe it's cheaper to come to Ireland. So can you talk about any of that? Because I'm sure that impacts disproportionately, what
Yeah.
comes into the country.
It's a kind of an old story. It's Ireland's relationship to US corporate corporate culture, really. Like, so we have a long history of encouraging foreign direct investment, FDIs, right back to like Apple set up a plant in Ireland in the 80s. We've had Ford, we've had these kind of big companies. So there's Irish government, because we're an English speaking country, because we have such close cultural relations with the United States going back, since the emigration in the 19th century and before. And also because we're like one of the first geographical stepping stones between the US and continental Europe, we have this relationship with the US that just goes back a very long time. And I think we at the moment, all of the major tech companies, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Apple, sorry, not Apple, are headquartered here in Ireland. And that is for tax reasons in a lot of cases. It's got access to workforce. And just by, I suppose, there's a proximity to the headquartering, they set up their data centers here as well. Now, there's loads of reasons why a data center is set up in certain places. They're not these kind of anonymous boxes that can just be put anywhere. They need, first of all, they need to work. They need to connect to quite advanced fiber infrastructure. So in the 90s and 80s, there was, especially in the late 90s, was huge investment put into that infrastructure around Dublin. So there was a setup there that these could actually function in the Dublin landscape. Secondly, Ireland is not kind of densely populated. So there's parts of, as you get into the kind of exurbs, there's quite a lot of open space that can be utilized by data centers. Thirdly, data centers love predictability. Anybody who sets up data centers. So like environmental concerns, we have a very temperate climate. It's a predictable climate in a lot of ways, and it's a coolish climate. So the data centers, again, these are kind of benefits for data center construction. You won't find data centers being put in places where there's kind of, very difficult or extreme kind of areas prone to extreme weather events. So there's
So they don't mind the rain, the
they don't
constant
mind
rain.
rain. No, in fact, it can be a benefit to them as well. But it's an old story. Like what I'm interested in, like, and again with my work with Annex, is that these stories are not new stories. Like, so the tech might look new, but the attitude, the kind of what's happening is kind of ancient in a way. So the you know, there's a little island off the coast of the west coast, off the coast of Kerry, called Valentia Island, and that island was the point where North America and Europe were connected by the first transatlantic telegraph cable in the mid 19th century. And that was literally, like, these are a big part of the story of kind of mass planetary scale communications infrastructure, is dragging a cable from one area of the planet to another. So you have to be able to find a route, and Ireland happens to be one of the first stops between the US or North America and mainland Europe. So this cable started, it was a telegraph cable. It was connected Valentia Island in Ireland to Newfoundland in Canada, and then those messages were then continued on to the British Empire. So that telegraph cable was set up to kind of, to connect the kind of United States of America to the British Empire, basically. And Ireland was in the way of that. And that's kind of what our role, and it's the same now. There's big cables being kind of brought across from North America, fiber optic cables. They're connecting into Ireland, and that's using it as a base point for the rest of Europe. So your question about, is this data storage for Ireland? No, we're like an infrastructural backyard for Europe. So all of like the big tech companies are sitting here. We have, as a culture, very little access to that storage information. It's global. It's really global. It's global data storage for a global population. We just happen to be providing the land, the climate, the energy, and we're suffering from the emissions. So we're getting penalized, basically, or we will be penalized quite soon for the emissions that these buildings cause as well, even though it's a very distributed system. Sorry, it was a long answer, but
No, that was going to be one of my next questions, was, since you are hosting these massive data centers, I'm sure there are environmental impacts, but also, are the companies that are building these storage centers helping in any way to build up the grid, and to, kind of bring, I don't know, more reliable or sustainable energy to the country overall, since they are using up, which I think you said 20 to 30% of the energy in the country, which is a huge number for especially such a small, nation.
what they're doing is buying up the available renewable energy. Like, there's a kind of a lot of misdirection happening here. So the Ireland has and I'm not sure how it works in the United States, or even at, I suppose, a state level. I don't know how your electricity grids work, but here all of the energy produced on the island goes into a central state-controlled pot, and that pot is then distributed to every citizen and company on the island. So, like, if I'm charging my iPhone in a wall, I have the same energy mix as Amazon, who are plugging their data center into the national grid. So, for instance, in the last couple of years, the mix is normally something like 60 to 70% fossils, 30% renewables. So it's gas and oil would be the primary fossils, and then a mixture of wind. Mainly wind would be the renewables at the moment. Yeah. So no matter who you are, big or small, when you plug into the grid, you're getting the same energy mix as the next person. So Apple had a big issue here, where they were building a huge data center complex on the West Coast, and they were making the claim that it was going to be supported with 100% renewable energy, which is kind of, they can't actually make that claim, because they can't, even if they produce the power themselves, they're not actually allowed to use that power. They'd have to distribute it into the grid, and it would have to be redistributed back out. But what they weren't actually doing any of that. They were just simply buying up. It was like carbon offset or carbon offsetting. They were just investing in renewable, or like wind farms in Ireland, and basically saying that energy was theirs now. So they were removing renewable energy basically from the grid by setting up shop. They weren't adding anything new, and that we're finding that a lot. Like, there's Amazon are investing in wind farms, but they're not building wind farms. They're just investing in the wind farms that are already under construction or underway. So, every time you build a data center, one Amazon facility in North Dublin is projected to consume about 5% of Ireland's electricity. So they can be built, planned and built in a few years. So if you plan and build one of those things, you're adding another major uh, energy sucker, for a better phrase, to the grid, faster than you can ever build a wind farm to support it. Wind farms take years because of planning problems and environmental impact assessments and all of that sort of stuff. So to build a wind farm or any sort of energy infrastructure is a long-term plan. To build a data center is actually very fast. So there's a real dissonance in speed between one and the other, and the claims one makes about the other. So it's I think it's an intractable problem. You can't have it both ways, I don't think.
Well, and I imagine the more energy they're sucking up, it's raising prices for the average person, for other businesses, and therefore cost of living, goes up. And I know with these kinds of projects, they always argue we're bringing jobs, we're gonna, people are gonna make more money, and it'll improve quality of life. But then there's these, maybe they're intended, maybe they're unintended consequences, though, that kind of have the opposite effect. And I'm sure you've kind of looked at some of that as well.
Yeah, like the fact of the matter is they don't really even bring that many jobs. An average data center employs maybe 20 to 30 people, and they can be, 10,000 square meters in size. They can be huge complexes that have very few people kind of pottering around inside them. There's kind of interesting sort of how would you say, ecologies forming around data centers now, which is like we'll see how it plays out. So Amazon in South Dublin are now plugging their data center, and it's not Amazon's initiative, actually. It's the local county council or the local government's initiative. Amazon had 4 data centers in this area, and they wanted to build a 5th one, and South Dublin County Council only would allow them to build the 5th on the condition that they would harness the waste heat and use that, recycle that into the local community. So there's a telehospital, there's a university, there's a cultural building, there's all sorts of offices, and there's a huge amount of apartments basically being plugged into the exhaust pipes of Amazon, for want of a better phrase, to utilize the waste heat, that the masses of waste heat that are produced by these buildings. So they predict that by doing this, they're removing 1,600 tons of CO2 from this area's kind of like annual emissions. But really, all they're doing is offsetting that somewhere else, because the energy has to be produced and delivered somehow, and it's not, unless the energy going into that Amazon facility is green, or at least the majority of it is green, then it's still producing, these are still emissions producing systems that are not sustainable. They're just, what you're doing is tying together tech and public utility, and you're creating these new strange kind of forms of public private, these new relationships between public and private interests that are very, very strange. Like, Amazon's interests are not as an energy provider. Their interest is as a management. Their interests lie in the management of data. And so the data always will come first for them. Whereas an energy provider or a utility provider, their aim would be to provide a utility. So you get these two maybe slightly kind of different worlds colliding and be bound together in a very long-term relationship. If they become the kind of central heating system for a very, very large suburb, how do you unwind that relationship in the future? And what are the contractual kind of, and I have tried to find these contracts. They should be publicly available, and I'll let you know when I do find out more information about them. But I'd love to be able to pour through what are the break clauses. How does somebody get out of this relationship? Like, how do Amazon get out of it? How did the South Dublin County Council get out of it? How much energy does Amazon have to provide, or heat does it have to provide? Is there an onus on the Amazon facility to become more efficient? Because if they become more efficient, then it will produce less heat. So there's all these kind of relationships that are really strange when you start binding, tech together. And then if you actually roll out that a little bit further, it gets even stranger. So where are they getting the heat to distribute into homes? They're getting it from us watching things like Netflix. So Netflix is, when I checked last, was a client of Amazon Web Services. So if you're watching Netflix, you're setting off like a program on Netflix, you're setting off a chain of events that ends with a puff of heat coming out of a server in a server hall in a data center. That puff of heat is captured and recycled into a hospital bed, a ward, or a university classroom, or a home. So us as consumers of content are now becoming a kind of resource that can be extracted from and converted into a utility and sold somewhere else down a supply chain. So that's kind of almost psychedelic in its kind of strangeness. I think these kind of new kind of ecologies that are forming around tech and data and the body in a way.
Yeah, and I can see how that could be a dangerous relationship, like you said, because if they are providing, these essential services to the community, then it's going to be hard to stop them down the road, or cut those ties off. And it kind of just seems like a really complicated, fancy way to greenwash, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about a lot of that was happening, and I'm sure that's happening in other parts of the world as well. So
Yeah.
something to be looking out for.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's circle back to, you kind of touched on this earlier, to just the impact of this technology on the local environment. We've seen huge technological advancements over the last century, and before that, and little by little, that's improved our quality of life, but it's also come at a great cost to the environment, to the planet, in terms of resource consumption, pollution, and all sorts of other problems. So what are some examples of how these technologies have had drastic or surprising environmental impacts, whether in Ireland or just in other places around the world that you've studied?
Yeah, so like I think when we Annex as a group started to investigate like the material impact of of data processing, we found actually the subject so head spinningly complex that it was really hard to find anywhere to begin to sort of unpick that story. So what we actually ended up doing is rolling back, and I mentioned the telegraph cable earlier on. We started to look at that and went, okay, well that's the first instance of like continent to continent instant messaging. So the very first moment of kind of creating messages out of apparently nothing, like was in the mid 19th century. So we started going, right, well, okay, I suppose that's where the beginning, that's where the cloud begins in some kind of way, or that's where the internet begins in some sort of like that's the legacy infrastructure for the internet. So like we started to look at that, and we went, okay, well that's we can kind of wrap our heads around this. This is a cable to a building at one end, a building at another, and it's linked by a cable, and they're sending messages. That's got to be an easy thing to start to understand. But then when we started to look at the cable itself, you start to get into head spinningly complex supply chains. So this is 150 years ago. It's 160, 170 years ago. We looked at the cable. So the copper came from kind of mines in Norfolk. There was iron in the cable, but there was a substance that we found really kind of fascinating, and none of us had heard of it before. It was called, it's a latex that was an electrical insulator that protected the cable, basically. Protected the cable. And it was made from a latex that was harvested from a tree called a gutta percha tree, the Palacum gutta percha tree, which was a common tree found in Southeast Asia. And from kind of colonial exploits, the British discovered the kind of properties of this particular latex. To make the cable, they had to harvest the latex. They paid indigenous tribes in Southeast Asia, different countries across Southeast Asia, in the forests, the kind of rainforest there, to start to harvest this latex from the forests. So they had to cut down trees. They basically had to fell trees to harvest this stuff. And over the course of sort of 30 years, starting from like the 1850s up until about 1910, 1905, something like that, they felled about 70 million trees to create these kind of cable infrastructures, these kind of telegraph cable infrastructures. So to get the amount of latex, they could only get like 15, 20, 30 grams of latex per tree. So they were going to get a small amount of latex at the cost of every tree. So whole areas of rainforest were raised across kind of a place like Singapore and Indonesia. And what happened then, the tree almost went into extinction. We tried to kind of track down one in Europe, and during lockdown, I have quite extensive email chains with botanists around Europe, and tried to find one and go see it basically. But really, there's very few of them left in the world, and they're coming back, but they're still on the endangered list basically because of this activity 150 years ago. And the kind of, again, the tragedy of that is not just that they took a tree and harvested it to a point of extinction to make these cables. This apparently weightless form of telecommunications or communications, this instant messaging system, was raising whole rainforests in Southeast Asia. But what happened was that they never replaced the trees. So the trees became plantations. And they're now what we know as the palm oil plantations. So the legacy of that first culling of trees to make these cables has produced these extremely long-term ecological kind of like a kind of a slow burn, hardcore ecological disaster that's moved from one to another to another to another. So that's one material from 150 years ago, and like the people of Southeast Asia are still dealing with the environment, and the rainforests of Southeast Asia are still dealing with the environmental consequences of that. So when we start to kind of extrapolate that, we think of that when it comes to the contemporary cloud, like how much damage is being done globally when you think of the complexity of the supply chains that come together to make the kind of global cabling, the kind of data centers, the phones, all the rare earth metals that go into the phones, the kind of like human labor, the cheap human labor that goes into kind of mining metals, it's literally a globalized supply chain, which is built around kind of the most invasive kind of extractive sort of, sort of processes or whatever you want to call it. So and then I'm not even talking about the energy. I'm not even talking about the kind of fossil fuels that go into underpinning all of this sort of stuff. So again, it's like, where do you want to start with this question? So we never really got further than the kind of 19th century before our heads were spinning and kind of we were crying, like we were distraught about the kind of ecological consequences, because we still haven't figured out how to deal with that ecological consequence yet, and that's 150 years ago. So again, I don't want to depress your listeners too much, but it is head spinningly complex when it comes to these kind of globalized systems, infrastructural systems.
Yeah, and that's just one example of how far-reaching, our technology that we use here in our homes, whether it's in the U.S. or Europe or wherever, the resources come from all over the world, and like you said, really impact local communities. And you could say the same with the clothes we wear and the cars we drive, and any basic necessity that we use these days. It's very global, even though we may buy something at the local store. It has global roots. So that's an interesting story that we could probably start digging in a lot of other things, like you said, and see the impacts.
Just on that, the one thing is that at least with the clothes we wear, we can feel them and we can kind of critique them as a kind of thing. What we're really interested in as a group is actually dispelling the idea that the cloud itself is this weightless thing. It doesn't have consequences, and that's the kind of the lie we've all bought into, in a way, that our actions our daily actions on our computer and phone really don't have consequences because it's just weightless. It's data. It's ones and zeros. It goes somewhere. Who cares? And that's the difference between, like, for us, between the kind of the history of, say, looking at environmental destruction through waste and overconsumption. That's it's a story that's gained traction since the 1960s or whatever. This idea of data is just, it's connecting the ones and zeros to like this kind of heavyweight footprint that actually it has. And I think for a lot of people, and even for us as people who are really dealing with this subject, it's a really hard one to kind of imagine. It's very hard to imagine the consequences of your actions on your phone, because there's you're not literally connected to anything, and you're not. So I don't know. It's just that it's a little different, I think, to a lot of our other kind of consumptive habits. Just for me, anyway, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. And I always hear people say, "Don't print that. Be green. Keep
Mm.
it digital." And now that you're saying all this, it's like, is it really that much greener to not print something, because it does have to be stored somewhere and accessed, on your phone and or through the cloud? So it's a new way of kind of thinking about what is green. Is it
Yeah.
the paper that we're cutting down to print it on, or is it the coal or whatever we're burning to store it in a data center? there's
Forever.
still there's still a consequence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess, can you talk about some of the local and global trends concerning these environmental issues? You've kind of already shared some of the statistics as far as energy consumption in Ireland, but do you have, I don't know, numbers or just a broad summary of kind of the resources that we consume in order to make the cloud possible, and the pollution that it produces, or is that still is, kind of being figured out?
It's very hard. Like you can read 20 different research papers and you'll get 20 different answers on that. Like it's I've heard anything from like global data center energy consumption is anywhere between 1% of the total electricity in the world, and 10%, 15%, like projected in the next few years. So again, it's not something like Greenpeace do these reports actually every few years where they try and kind of map out how dirty is the cloud. Um, but again, it's one of these. I couldn't put a figure on it. I would actually advise people to go and look at historic Greenpeace kind of studies in this. They're really good. But again, it's just like even within Ireland, which you would imagine it's relatively quantifiable how much energy has been used. The projected figures, I mentioned 30 at the top of the show, but like some people say it's as much as 50, 60, 70%, so and then others will say it's much less. So it depends on who's who's constructing the information in a lot of ways. But it also just points to how difficult these kind of systems are to actually capture in a kind of in a sort of a in an understandable way their consumption. So no, I wouldn't have any really clear answers on that. Yeah.
Well, fair enough. That's, yeah, it's kind of impossible to know how much how much energy people are using at all times all over the world. But obviously, it's not, sustainable. We're not going to be able to continue building things and consuming energy at the rate we have been forever, because we're going to run out of resources to build them with, or things to burn, or whatever. I mean, unless we get super good at renewables. So um, from what you've seen, are there any sustainable solutions or things being developed to, make this more long lasting? Or are we going to run out of, resources and energy someday and just not be able to use the internet because of that?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of different things. Like, um, what is the internet? Like, who has access to the internet? What is a data center? Who has access to a data center? Are all kind of interesting questions. So, the data centers who are really responsible for the most energy consumption in Ireland are they're privately owned big tech. So that it would be Microsoft, it'll be Facebook, and particularly Amazon have a lot of data centers here. Did I mention Facebook? They all TikTok are building a huge one. So it's like the internet. We know data centers are really useful as ways to store and manage and distribute information. We know the internet can be profoundly useful. But it's all kind of been hijacked by big tech. So a lot of the questions about kind of, mismanagement of sort of like, data on the internet, the problems that Facebook have run into, the problems Twitter are now running into. Like these are where we spend a lot of our public life, and we have to kind of question whether these kind of systems that are created by private companies are the places we want to kind of live, and are they useful, and are they worth the energy that's going into producing these kind of private spaces. Like a data center that just shares, like is a Facebook data center that's hoovering up huge amounts of electricity useful culturally? But is a data center that manages like a hospital's kind of data storage, or a whole a statewide series of hospitals there, like is that a useful data center? It probably is. So having these kind of large urban scale computers, which a data center is, can be really useful, but we just can't keep building them endlessly, because they have a huge amount of environmental, cost. There is a point where we have to just say, okay, well, what is a useful way, and what what way of kind of consuming that much energy through that type of building aligns with our values wherever we are in the world. Like, and is there a point where we just say, no, that sort of data center is not no more is not useful to us anymore, or is not appropriate in this place, or is actually a kind of a, is causing more problems than it's creating kind of value for a society. So data centers themselves are like, they're tools like anything else. You can use a hammer to fix something, or you can use a hammer to kill. You know what I mean? So the data center is kind of the same thing in that world. It can be incredibly harmful if it's used for the wrong goal or means, but it can also be incredibly useful if it's put to good work. So like, you're starting to see communities that are building their own kind of localized data centers in small sort of like, there's kind of work going on in a research hub in Dublin looking at kind of community data centers, community file storage systems, maybe not even data center is the right word, that then can be kind of managed in a green way, so they can be supported by green energy. So what we might see in the future, I'd like to see, is less of these kind of mega structures that operate globally, and maybe more smaller scale, quantifiable ones that kind of are useful locally. And that could be the way we move forward. It's a little utopian, I suppose, at the moment, but that could be the way we move forward. And if you have a smaller scale data center, you can start looking at kind of supporting it renewably. So in Switzerland, they have like data centers that are fueled through hydroelectric stations. So data centers are actually set up near mountains, and they use hydroelectric power to fuel themselves. So you might see data centers set up to take advantage of a local climate. Like in Ireland, we have plenty of wind, we have wave energy. If we set up and develop our data centers in relation to the limitations of the energy available to us, I think, yeah, we can have a kind of a some kind of we can cohabit with these structures in a kind of sensible way. But at the moment, it's going the other way. It's absolutely going the other way.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say that local, smaller scale projects are probably best, and we hear that all the time with a lot of environmental issues. So it's almost as
Yeah.
if there's a trend there that we should be following, but instead, like you said, we're going the other way in a lot of ways. So, um, okay, well, this has definitely given us a lot to think about, and I know, like, when I use the internet, I'm much more try to be much more conscious of, kind of the fact that everything I do is being stored somewhere and not just up there free or whatever. So I think that's the first step for a lot of folks, is just knowing that things don't just happen, and there's consequences, and then we start to think about how can we do better. Um, but I'd like to talk now about a project you've brought up a couple times. You've mentioned Annex, which is a collaboration of artists, architects, and urban researchers born and or based in Ireland who explore the material and cultural implications of large technical systems for the built environment with reference to architecture, art, computer science, and gaming platforms. Does that pretty much sum it up?
It does, yeah.
Okay, that was directly off your website. So
Yeah.
Your group, this group developed the Entanglement project, which is actually how I found out about your work, because it was featured at the Galway International Arts Festival, which I volunteered at earlier this year. And this piece explored, among other things, the environmental impacts of human data production and consumption. And it was really just like a visual representation of both how technology and the environment are intertwined, and also about Ireland's unique history and role in communications technology, which we have talked about. So it kind of brought together the history, like you said, of this, centuries old telecommunications infrastructure, and today the data that Ireland's storing. So can you kind of give some background on how this project was conceived, and what it is exactly?
Well, yeah. So ultimately the project manifested um, in a big, I suppose, a large scale physical installation. So that's the kind of final form of it. It's a piece of infrastructure. It's a piece of art, I suppose, or an artistic installation that uses kind of multimedia in a way to kind of generate an effect. We got involved, and I'll go into it a little bit more just in a few minutes. But the group came together to propose something for the Venice Architecture Biennale, which is pretty much the biggest architecture event in the world, and it's located in Venice every 2 years. It's basically dovetails with the Venice Art Biennale, and we won the commission to become Ireland's representation at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and I I was interested in looking at data centers, as I've mentioned here. Like Ireland has this kind of, proliferation of data centers, a huge amount of data centers. And I kind of knew it wouldn't be that interesting to look at only data centers. So I asked some people I knew were interested in the subject to come together and form the team Annex. And that's how Annex was sort of born. We came together to look at this subject. But then when we came together, we came from very different backgrounds. So there's like Alan Butler is an artist who looks at video gaming platforms. Claire Lister is a professor of architecture, actually based in Chicago, and she looks at kind of large scale logistical systems. So she would have looked at FedEx and how they work at a kind of landscape scale to produce to create flows of sort of parcels and packaging and all of that sort of stuff. So she's not a traditional architect by any means. She's more kind of thinking about how systems of flows work at a very large scale. There's Fiona McDermott comes from looking at kind of smart technologies. She's a urban designer and kind of comes from she researches in and around the world computer science. Sven Anderson is an artist who looks at kind of public, like he makes public art, but he kind of harnesses kind of infrastructures like kind of Wi-Fi infrastructures or sound or anything like that. He kind of harnesses the hidden infrastructures in our environment. And David Cabener is an architect, but he's also a philosopher, and he thinks about kind of the impact of the digital on public space. So when we came together, we realized that not one of us had a clear trajectory to this project, that we all were looking at the subject of data infrastructure, but from very different kind of viewpoints, which was really fascinating. And I think it was one of those things where you learn that this subject can only really be tackled through multiple lenses, because your own ideas about this stuff has to be challenged regularly for any meaning to be made of it. We all make a lot of assumptions about things, and especially when you come into contact with other disciplines, those assumptions are naturally challenged, and it's actually a very difficult process, but it's a very healthy process. And we decided, like, ultimately that we were looking at big tech, but we didn't really want to kind of focus on big tech either. We wanted to look at data infrastructure in Ireland, and like some of the more kind of, I don't know, some of the ways in which we as a species kind of like approach this stuff. And the installation is it's built using data center stuff that we found in data center catalogs. So if you were building a data center, you get these kind of catalogs of server racks, and you pick X amount of this size, and this size. And we literally just did that. We picked cables, we picked server racks, screens, fans, all of these things that you might find, not all in a data center, but all of them representative of something that you would find in a data center. And we built this huge kind of 3-tier structure, basically, that housed these screens and fans and these kind of sound effects of spaces of data processing. the structure itself we built as a kind of bonfire shape, and maybe this is the easiest. I don't, because your listeners are listening and they're not seeing the structure, I don't want to go into too much detail about what it does, but the shape of it is this sort of bonfire shape. It's a three-tiered system, and we basically took all the server cabinets and we burned them, so they're scorched as well. And we found that the bonfire, initially we were talking about the campfire, but we found the bonfire to be a really good maybe metaphor for this conversation, in that we as a species, and this I suppose is another part of our project, is to kind of take our mind. We can easily get distracted by new technologies, and they're new and strange and alienating, but we as a species kind of do the same thing over and over and over again. From the very beginning of our species, we've been yearning, and the kind of success of our species in some ways is the ability to kind of get together and communicate and form groups. And the earliest form of technology that the human species created was the campfire. And the campfire did many things. It allowed us, it created heat, but it also created light. So it extended the night. It extended the day into the night. We could sit around campfires. We could discuss religious kind of ideas, social ideas, form social groups, form religious groups around the campfire. But to make a campfire, we were taking from the environment. We had to chop down trees, we had to dry them, we had to burn them. So there's even research out there that says the campfire actually changed the human's brain chemistry, like so that most of our ape relatives stay awake for only 8 hours a day. We are I think the only primate that stays awake for 16 hours a day. And there's some research that suggests that it's actually our relationship to the fire that changed us. So we're a tool-making creature. We're a technology-using creature. And those technologies change us as much as we change and create them. So we found this idea of the campfire, and then the bonfire itself being a scaled-up version of the campfire, but a little bit more terrifying. We gather around bonfires because we find them kind of exhilarating. We dance around them. Particularly Halloween has just passed here in Ireland. There was plenty of teenagers dancing around bonfires for a night. But they're dangerous, but they're also exciting. And we found that this kind of metaphor was really interesting for our project, in that as a species, we've been using technologies to gather together from the very beginning. And to make those technologies, whether it's the campfire or whether it's the internet, we've been harnessing from the environment, we've been extracting from the environment, and to a certain extent, we've just been burning it to gather, And we see that the project Entanglement, on one level, is like a contemporary bonfire we're trying to create, and we're trying to talk through these very scary new technologies. But we want to couch the conversation as something much older and much deeper, and we wanted to have a conversation around the fact that we've been doing this much longer than the data center has existed, or the telegraph cable has existed, or any other form of kind of community. We've been doing this from the beginning, and we have this kind of relationship to the environment, and we have this relationship to the other, and sometimes the two don't always kind of align. So that's a kind of a big conversation that we were hoping to have around this kind of artwork and this kind of infrastructure. I'm not sure if that was your take on it, but that was certainly a big kind of goal for me and for Annex.
Yeah, I thought the installation was brilliant, and once I understood exactly what it was and what you guys, the little pieces, what they meant and represented, it made more sense, and it really brought together the message of technology and fire and heat, and how it's, like you said, it's the most basic technology we had, but it's still today, something that we're implementing or is a byproduct of the things we're inventing. And for those who are listening and are interested, we'll link to photos or the website for this project so you can actually see it for yourself. But yeah, there's pieces within this bonfire structure that are made up of the old cables and the transatlantic cables, that is, and then there's some of the plants that you talked about, the rubber plants that went into making these cables, which I thought was really neat, because you're kind of tying together that history, and then also using modern day server platforms and screens and heat cameras and things like that. So it is a very interesting kind of abstract, compilation of all these different technologies, and I thought it was really cool. Um, so what is next for Annex, and/or your own research? Like, do you guys have more projects in the works, or are you looking at something similar to what you've been doing, or something completely different?
Well, yeah, there's a few different things. So has Annex really came together for that one project. So I suppose we're maybe now working in smaller groups. I'm not sure. Just logistically, we're six individuals with six very different practices who came together, and even just making that work was very complex. So at the moment, we're working in smaller groups, and I myself am continuing on with my personal research into data centers and fire and heat. That's something that I'm kind of personally driven by. But another part of the project in Entanglement was this AI that we used to produce the text. So myself and two other members of Annex are looking into this kind of just thinking about kind of artificial intelligence and energy and the domestic environment in particular. So how our homes are now being kind of like, well, I suppose for a long time now, they're becoming more technologically, they're shifting into a kind of more machine space than they are into something maybe more traditionally domestic in the 19th century. We're introducing a lot of objects into our homes which are, doing things that I think we're not all completely sure what they're doing and who they're serving. So we're starting to look at kind of smart objects in the home and artificial intelligence and those kind of new relationships that are developing over the last 5-10 years and into the future. So that would be one project we're looking at. That may or may not be an opera. So
Yeah, that's a big one. And I imagine the energy consumption that comes from all these smart devices, incremental little things that are added on, even just for functions that, may not be a lot by themselves, but added together is probably pretty huge. And
yeah, and again, it's not easily quantifiable because if you have an Alexa, it's basically running off. It's not really, the energy consumption is not something it's not really related to how it's being recharged in your home. It's actually the giant data center that's crunching the algorithms that allows Alexa to, ask you the right questions. So you're not paying the electricity bill, but there is a massive electricity bill being produced somewhere else. So that it's those kind of, that putting that little smart object in your home is connecting you to this kind of global infrastructure of data centers and yeah. So yeah, there's lots there. There's a lot of huge terrain there, and we're only scratching the surface. So we'll see. It'll be a few years before anything emerges from that, I think.
yeah, well, definitely something interesting to look out for. And I've managed to resist the smart home,
Yeah, me
trend
too.
so far, mostly because I don't understand it, and I just feel like I can turn the light on myself. Why do I need to
I know. Yeah.
program something? But I'm sure, in the future, it'll all be connected in some way. So,
Yeah, I'm with you
well,
on that. I don't really. I was offered a smart toilet the other day, and I didn't ask really. I didn't follow up.
why though? Like, I don't even understand.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Well, this has been very interesting and thought provoking. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you think you'd want to mention real quick before we move on?
I suppose for anybody around the world, I know in like this is like a real pressing issue for anybody who's living in the United States. Like you've got probably the biggest concentration of data centers in the world. So I think anybody who just kind of look out for them in your local area. Like I know in some of the southern states there was kind of those, and especially Texas, it was like a year or two ago, there was huge energy, there's problems with energy and outages and all of that sort of stuff. Like we're getting into a realm now where like our energy grids are being saturated by all of these kind of different systems, and it is worth looking out as to what's going on where and what it's for. So like one nice, well, sorry, nice is the wrong word, but a really interesting take on analyzing a data center I came across from these this French community group in northern Paris. About 10 years ago, this area of Paris was attracting lots of data centers, and suddenly the energy grid was saturated, so they couldn't build anymore of anything in this area. And nobody knew what a data center was. This was about 2010. So the local communities were like, well, what are these things? So, hold on, what's just saturated our grid? So again, the whole conversation became about electricity, and that's what's happening in Ireland at the moment, and I'm sure that's what's happening in the States as well. Anywhere there's data centers, there's always these questions around electricity consumption. This other group came at it from a very different way, and they were a small community group, and they started saying, okay, so the electricity thing, that's one thing about these data centers, which is a problem, but is that solvable? I don't know. They started going, like, well, what's that one doing? What does that data center actually do? And the response was from the company, oh, it's computers. They just process information. So this group followed up even again more persistently. Went, no, tell us exactly what it does. What are you processing? So it turned out that one of the major clients for that data center was a online betting company. So that this community group went, well, that's a casino. So that's what that building is. If like 60% of your revenue is coming from an online betting company, and the computers are processing bets, that's what it does. What's the difference between that and a casino? And they weren't given any really good answers. And I thought that was a really clever way of actually dispelling the myth around these things, is saying, well, what's the computers in that actually doing? And you don't need a computer science degree to ask that question. You just need to ask, you have to look up the client list and say, well, actually, ethically, are we okay with there being a casino in our backyard? Because it's not being classified as a casino. It's been given a license to operate as if it's not a casino. So I found that for anybody who finds the topic kind of too head-spinningly complex and finds computers daunting and feels they need a computer science degree to even begin to talk about this stuff, they're simple questions we can all ask. Like, what's that building doing? And that's I found that very, very, that was almost like a game changer of a way of perceiving these buildings. So that was something that we can all ask what's happening, and I think they're good questions to ask when we don't know the answer,
Yeah, and I think they depend on us to kind of be confused or just accept their answers of, oh, well, it's computer stuff you wouldn't understand.
Yeah.
But really, yeah, it doesn't have to be that complicated, and maybe they're just putting an overly complicated answer on something that's not. And maybe it's just a matter of we need to catch up with the laws, or the regulations need to catch up, because like when online sales started years ago, we didn't have to pay sales tax, and local communities weren't seeing the benefits of those sales because people were spending their money elsewhere. And finally the laws caught up, at least in parts of Texas, where the local municipalities started getting sales tax revenue from sales online, because for a while people just were like, oh, this is how we're going to get them, is the consumer doesn't have to pay. And
that's great. Yeah, that's a totally appropriate example.
Yeah. But yeah, the the Texas grid. I'm in Texas right now, and you're absolutely right. It's abysmal here, and a lot of that I'm sure has to do with how much demand there is for what's available, and also just how it's managed overall. But these are things we're going to have to think about. Unlimited growth isn't going to last forever, especially if we're not thinking about how we're going to support that growth and the infrastructure that goes into keeping the lights on. So, well, are there any resources you would like to share with our listeners who want to learn more about this or your work?
I think just from I suppose if your listeners are mainly based in America, there's some really good researchers over there who are looking at data centers. And one particular, I'll just give you one name, but you'll find more. Mel Hogan, who's based in Canada, but she looked at NSA data centers in Utah and their water consumption. So it was, her research, I think the paper is called Water Woes and Data Center Woes and Water Flows. Sorry, I can't quite remember the name now offhand, but Mel Hogan, Data Center Woes and Water Flows, or some combination of those words. And it just looks at the kind of like ecology around water management and data centers and local communities. And it's a really fascinating read, quite a short read, really fascinating read, that will kind of give you an insight into kind of the complex ecologies and the extractive processes that these data centers need in order to survive. So that would be one. And if you look at her work, you'll end up looking at lots more of other stuff. So yeah, she's well worth looking at. There's plenty of people across the North American continent who are looking at this, particularly from the media studies end of things. Yeah. So that would, that I would kind of point people in that direction.
Okay, great. And you all actually put out a book as well about um, the Entanglement project. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, well, buy our book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll link to that, and that's a really cool history of what you guys did, and just photos of
Yeah.
the project itself, but also some of the maps of the transatlantic cables. I think I remember seeing, and
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
neat historical stuff if you're into that. So yeah, we'll link to all that stuff in our show notes, and you can find it there. So I guess we'll move on now to our green life hack portion of the show. And Donal, if you have one, would you like to start us out?
Well, yeah, it's kind of, you touched on it before. I get asked a lot about what do we do, with what does the individual do in relation to this this particular issue. And like, I think personally the individual, we needed to approach these kind of situations with a certain set of values that we are, we're meaningful about. Like, I think, we have to be clear. You mentioned the idea of endless growth. It just isn't a runner anymore. We have to kind of be serious about that. But I think these companies, in a lot of ways, want us to take personal responsibility. And I really do believe that, like, we need to kind of march and for regulation. And I think, as you mentioned, the sales tax, these kind of things are the only way we can tie down these big structures, these infrastructures. And like, I've given talks and people have come up and felt guilty about saving cat videos after the talk, and I tell them, don't feel guilty. That's not your fault. You know what I mean? This is a system that's set up to enable and encourage you to do that all the time. But if we have to kind of move away from the distractions of that and really lobby for change and control of these tech companies. And I think that would be it's not much of a hack. It's a really long-term, slow, hard fight. But if you have energy, put it into that, I would say. That would be my hope. Because only people at the scale of governments can take on these companies. And then they will then, I suppose, the example I used to give, I'm not sure how long ago this was, but I remember each of our cell phones had like kind of, a megabyte cap. And we could only use a certain amount of megabytes, and then our phone would run out. We'd have to top it back up, or we'd have to get it recharged in some way financially. But then we could actually visualize our data usage. It was like, okay, I could probably turn on my, this for an hour or two, and I could get access to the internet for an hour or two, but I have to be careful. We kind of have to go back to that, unfortunately. We have to sort of see that, data is not an endless commodity, and it's not a commodity that doesn't have like consequences in its production. So we have to sort of connect the dots back together again. It's like using kind of anything, it's any kind of resource that it has limitations, and we have to kind of be careful about it. But I would say, if you have energy, put it into lobbying your government before you start kind of trying to count your megabyte usage on your phone.
I remember when you were charged by the text message that you sent,
Yes,
even
that's it.
so. Yeah, I think there is something to be said for when you have unlimited access to something, you don't
Yeah.
value it as much, right? And
Yeah.
when you do have to pay for it and be more, careful about how much you use, then yeah, you do tend to be more
Yeah.
responsible with it, I guess, is the question, or the way to say it. And I think that's an important reminder. I know you said your hack was more of a long-term solution, but on an individual level, just the reminder that we are not fully responsible for these problems, so we should not have to solve them on our own. That they are systemic, structural issues that
Yeah.
the companies do like to push back on us and make us feel guilty about. But really, we can't, do it ourselves, and we do need to come together to kind of
Yeah.
pressure them
I
into
think
doing.
that, yeah.
Well, my green life hack, I've probably done something similar in the past, but kind of to keep on theme with this episode, is just to, um, try to repair your devices and your appliances and anything that breaks. We have a very disposable mindset these days, and especially with things like phones and TVs and refrigerators or whatever. When they break, our instant reaction is, well, just time to get a new one. But sometimes you can actually fix them for much cheaper, much easier, and much less impact on the environment. So try to keep those going, because I mean, I've had my my cell phone for about 5 or 6 years, and it's still working. So I'm managing to hold on to that. But I know there's always the lure to get the newest and best thing. So I think the repair economy, is due for a comeback, and we need to try to make things last as long as we can to reduce resource consumption. So
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah.
that's my green life hack. And yeah, thank you guys for listening. You can find the show wherever you listen to podcasts on YouTube, and Facebook is being difficult right now. They've locked me out of the account, so maybe not Facebook at the moment, but Instagram and Twitter. And of course, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter at Het's Gonna Be Me. Donal, where can people find you and or your work online?
I think the Annex project is the most important thing to look at. So if you type in www.annex.ie, I think it'll bring you to our website, and it talks about the book, and there's videos to the artwork and everything there. So that would be the main, I direct people there.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and of course, if you ever have any thoughts or ideas for future topics or guests, feel free to send those our way as well through our website or social media. Thanks for listening, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.